Next topic today, again, this is probably my favorite thing to talk about, not in an exciting way because it's quite sad at some of the things that we've seen happen, but also it's why we exist, right? And so our commitment is that we want to allow applicants to have faith in your program, that when they go to apply, they know that they got the fair opportunity that they deserved and that they were not selected, they put up a good fight, and it was out of the fairness of it. And so with that said, what are the two main components? Again, there's a lot that can go into these review processes and workflows, but what are the two main components? So number one is we have to create an ecosystem for an impartial review. Many of you may be offering multiple scholarships. You might have different funders. You might have multiple phases of review and selection processes. You might have different committees. That's okay. We don't want to change anything, right? So in a typical environment for our reviewer clients is that they segment out their scholarship applicants into bite-sized pieces. Again, it could be phases of review. It could be categories, scholarships, whatever it might be. And that's totally fine. I don't want to change anything. The piece that I do want to maybe look into is once you have kind of what I call a bucket full of submissions and potential evaluators, how do you decide who's going to be reviewing who? And so for this is awful, but we have a client of ours that before working with us had over 900 scholarship essays, and they had a four-person committee that read every single one of those 900. There's no physical way that you can give the 900th applicant the same energy that you gave the first, and you're starting to get very cloudy of like, what was number three versus 800 again? And so we want to make sure we're doing a couple of things here. Is I want you to be able to take your applicants, somehow randomly distribute it out to the review committee, but then also be very aware of like the workload capacities of your selection team, as well as like how many reviews does each candidate need to get kind of a very accurate representation on the quality of their work. So if you're not currently surveying your review committees and kind of getting a better feel for like how long does it take you to review one, how many hours do you feel like you can put forth to this? You need to be doing that because you'll work backwards from those results to influence how many submissions each one will get and then how you distribute them out. The second piece to this is the redaction of data. So we magically figure out a way to give our review team submissions to review. The next thing is that we don't want them to be able to physically see demographic details, who they are. Ultimately, if you think it's personal identifying information, it probably is. Always err on the side of caution. Student information is virtually anything nowadays, right? So if it's not pertinent to the review and selection process, and what I mean by that is when your review team sits down, they look at somebody's submission, they fill out a score sheet. If the content that they're evaluating doesn't directly tie to the score sheet, just don't show it to them. It may not even be PII. It might just be, overwhelming your review committee with a bunch of stuff that's more so for record keeping purposes. Now, before I look at this in Reviewr, and again, this is a powerful tool we have, is if you're going to go this route, it does open a humongous challenge for you. This typically implies that not every applicant is being reviewed by the same reviewers. And if that's the case, I'm a huge fan of Shark Tank on ABC. If you remember Mr. Wonderful, he was always the quote unquote hard ass, right? And then you got Barbara, who's always the nice one. And so if that's the case, you got that going on. You cannot penalize applicants who were scored by Robert that weren't scored by Barbara. So I'm going to kind of tease that. We'll come back to that here in just a little bit. So how do you create these review workflows in Reviewr that encompass those two components? The one thing I do want to add before we go there, because I'm going to show this to you guys all together, is kind of broadening our evaluation criterias. Traditionally speaking, we give judges these score sheets, and the score sheets are going to be like a 1 through 5, a 1 through 10. You might weight them, that's totally fine. The challenge that we're starting to see, though, is oftentimes evaluators and humans in general get really kind of overwhelmed and bogged down in fine details. So if you've got like a 1 through 20 scale or a 1 through 30 scale, that's a bit on the larger end of the spectrum. And you're going to have people questioning like, well, what's the difference between a 24 and a 26, right? And it doesn't seem like a huge difference, but when you start to take into consideration averages, it really does impact the scores. We also want to kind of take a look at like when you go to do a selection of a candidate, let's start to kind of take away some of the more academic elements to it. I totally understand grades, all that kind of stuff is a huge driver in scholarships, and I'm not trying to change anything there. But at this point in time, when you've got a bunch of people who are all getting really good grades, it's not always a really good story about why they're deserving. So that's where I want to get it deeper into like your volunteer hours, how they're impacting their communities. Tell me more about their personal storytelling, their needs. Let them differentiate themselves from other candidates, and your score sheets have to align with that. So if you are taking into consideration things like your GPA or your volunteer hours, don't even have your review team score that. Technically speaking, in a tool like Reviewr, we know what their GPA is. And so if you want to give a certain point value for certain kind of brackets, 3.0 to 3.25, 3.25 onwards, whatever it might be, we can actually read the submission form, allocate a point value, and then merge it with overall selections. That way your review team isn't trying to read through that stuff and then auto assign their own points and kind of get bogged down in the math. So I'm going to come back to this. The solution, though, to this is instead of doing like a 1 through 5 or a 1 through 10, is treat it more like a reference template where you ask the review committees more of like an emotional statement of like, how do you feel about this topic? How do you feel about their academic achievements? How do you feel about their essay writing? And from good to great or thumbs up, thumbs down, start to incorporate more of like an emotional response. And then don't worry, behind the scenes, there still will be some type of point value. That way you can justify the results. They just, as they're filling it out, aren't in charge of, allocating points themselves. So all that said, what do these kind of 2 to 3 components look like in a tool like Reviewr? So if I jump back over here, we have a concept called bucketing, and it's our workflow management system. And again, I don't want to get too deep into the weeds of Reviewr today, but it is arguably one of the most impactful features that we have to save your team a significant amount of time and energy. But the goal here is that you create these review workflows based off of your desired processes. It could be a combination of the multiple scholarships you offer with the multiple phases of review. It could be, fall versus spring. Like there's an infinite number of ways to configure this. But at its core, we're basically taking a bunch of your scholarship applicants and we're going to drop them into a bucket that they belong to. Again, what bucket they belong to, we can kind of get into in a different discussion. Ideally, we are leveraging some type of automation. So for example, if I'm applying to the Lennox Wilder scholarship, the system knows, hey, Kyle belongs to that scholarship. So therefore, let's drop them into that bucket. The next step is to take your bucket. So again, let's jump down to the Lennox Wilder one, is to fill it up with a team of evaluators. So in this use case, whenever Simon, Paula, and Mark come into Reviewr, they're only going to see the submissions in the Lennox Wilder scholarship bucket. Now, in its core, that's great. You can have your evaluators in as many buckets as you want. It's how you kind of control privacy. Maybe you want to have like a chair that's leading that team of evaluators. We can encompass all of that. But the thing I want to show you next is once we open up our scholarship bucket, let's hypothetically say, in this example, we've got 6 submissions just for simplicity. Maybe there was 106 and you have a 10-person review committee. Well, they're probably not going to be reviewing all 106 because that's going to take them an overwhelming amount of time. So instead, let's figure out those things I mentioned earlier on. On average, how many submissions does my evaluation team feel comfortable scoring? And then backload that. How many evaluations does each submitter have to have a fair representation? So maybe that's no less than 4, no more than 6. Maybe it's exactly 6 scores get submitted for each submission, right? Whatever those numbers look like. And in our tool, you can actually bulk select people, and then you can auto assign them. So I could take all of my evaluators and then auto assign them out to ensure that every applicant gets looked at no more than 6 times, but no less than 4, because we know that that's our parameters. On this flip side of things, I could say, well, I know our team can never review more than 20 because that's just too many for them, but they have to review at least 12 because that's how many are required to ensure that they get reviewed 5 times each, right? So there's some math that comes into this, and our system will do all the math for you. But as soon as you press go, our system will take the submissions and then auto assign them back out magically for you. The next piece to that, though, is you have to have some type of way of recusing people. So ideally, as you're adding your review team into the system, there are some kind of elements that might say, hey, this person shouldn't be reviewing this type of candidate. So we can build that in. But I like to see in your score sheet some type of question that says I have to recuse myself. And if that is the case, you can then jump in here and override stuff. So I can take Mark as a judge, and I can maybe unselect Gabrielle because Gabrielle is golfing buddies with her father. And reassign this back out to Gilligan. So we're overriding the automation, but at its core, we're taking submissions and we're randomly assigning them out. So the next piece of the puzzle is the redaction of data. So in a tool like Reviewr, we can automatically redact stuff for you, assuming we know what it is. So name, email, demographic details, all that kind of fun stuff. Where a redaction of data becomes a bit more challenging is when it's open-ended text prompts. So things like essays, which the good news in Reviewr is that since we can't quite yet, and I say yet because we are working on it, identify what's PII in an essay prompt, you as a programs team can still read through things and make modifications before it gets in the hands of the evaluators. That's why we want to move it out of potentially file uploads and move it into essay prompts, because file uploads now require you to download things, manipulate the data, re-upload it back in. So Just kind of a fair warning on that front. So when reviewers come into the system, they get a menu and it shows them ideally a redacted list of the candidates that they're supposed to be scoring. Once they're in the system, they simply then click on the name or ID of who they're supposed to be reviewing, and we show them a split screen. So the left-hand side of my page is the redacted information. So it's whatever information you want the review team to see. You might have 150 questions and 32 uploads. That's fine, but you want them just to review these 6 questions and this one file. So we define what shows up for evaluators. They come into the system, they only see those 6 core components. You can also see off to the right now, I have my score sheet. And this is a really good example of how I like to structure scorecards where we lower the barrier. The evaluator is able to side by side, read through the form. They can jump up top. They can look at file uploads. I mentioned beforehand ease of access. So if it's a reference letter or if it's an image or whatever it might be, a transcript, they can press a view and it embeds itself in Reviewr. So they're never having to leave the system. And ideally, your score sheet follows along the format of your forms. And so they're answering things like, from poor to above average or from poor to tremendous, rate their extracurriculars, rate their leadership capabilities. Tell me more about their community service. When it gets into essays, like was the grammar right? Was the length right? Was the personal storytelling right? They're not, trying to assign 6 points here, 5 points here, 2 points here. They're just answering, yeah, this was tremendous. This was not tremendous. This was a below average. And then you will notice that at the bottom, just trying to indicate, it does do auto tabulations for you. So many of our clients don't even show the evaluation team scores anymore. They just make them fill this out. And then behind the scenes, it does the scorecards. So in our system, what ends up happening, and again, you can have them side by side review reference letters. They can click on the reference, boom, it shows up. I mentioned earlier on that if your references are having that scoring component, it can actually auto add it to the total score. So down here at the bottom where it says 29, part of that score might have been derived from the references. Again, I've seen everything at this point in time, and I kind of love that concept. But the goal here is that when you then kind of go to pull your ranking tool, it's going to show you a leaderboard, and in real time, it'll rank people from high to low on a per bucket basis, so per scholarship, per phase of review. It'll show you who your review teams were, their total scores, their averages. And for many of you, this might be the end all be all. This is how you make decisions. Some of you may leverage this for deliberation purposes. So you open this up and you guys kind of deliberate about it. But I want to kind of talk about one thing that leads into the next item.